All right.
That's great.
I think
Hey
let's
guys,
get started.
thank you. Welcome to the Project ALS prosetin live stream hosted by yours truly, Valerie Estes and Erin Fleming from Project ALS. Today, we're honored to welcome our special guest, Project ALS partner, a regulatory expert, Dr. Kevin Phelan, and we'll get to that interview in just a second. I just want to remind, especially let first comers know, that the purpose of this weekly program is to provide the ALS community and beyond up-to-the-minute progress reports on an exciting ALS drug candidate. That candidate is called prosetin. So for over 6 years, Project ALS has worked with researchers at Columbia University to develop prosetin. Now in 2020, our aim is to deliver prosetin to ALS patient trial. Quick summary, why are we so excited about prosetin? Well, number one, unlike most drugs, even those developed for ALS, prosetin gets into the brain. It crosses the Rubicon of what is known as the brain-blood barrier. Now, while the brain-blood barrier was designed by nature to keep bad things out of the brain, it has also prevented doctors from getting helpful medicines into the brain. So that's one of the great features of prosetin. It penetrates the brain readily. The second reason we're excited about prosetin is it's taken orally. There are no pumps, infusions necessary, so sort of easy peasy on the delivery. And third, we're excited about prosetin because it has an intended therapeutic target, which is a cell stress pathway called endoplasmic reticulum stress, which is implicated not only in ALS, but in Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. So those are sort of the big three reasons for our excitement today. And another purpose of the live stream is to let you know that Project ALS is still on track to get prosetin to its first patient trial in 2020. Obviously, the COVID situation and shutdown has forced delays, but with you and people like Dr. Phelan, who you'll meet in a second, we plan to keep delays to an absolute minimum. COVID-19 is a national health emergency. So is ALS and related neurodegenerative diseases. So we must continue really to focus as a community, really as a family, to get prosetin to trial ASAP. Now, by the way, do you guys have questions or thoughts about this conversation? Write in. I forgot about the interactive part of this. But we really want to hear from you. And I know that Kevin and Erin and I really look forward to being responsive to you today on today's live stream. But first, so today we're going to learn about the regulatory hurdles that prosetin must clear in order to pass through the FDA with a stamp of approval. But what even is a regulatory hurdle? So let's learn, shall we? I want to pass this to Erin. What's a regulatory hurdle? Please help us to understand with our special guest today.
Thanks, Valerie. Yeah, I think I'll leave the question of what a regulatory hurdle is to Kevin. I just want to start by introducing Kevin and giving a little bit of his background and also just some sense of his importance to our prosetin team. I think that, he was the first person that we reached out to when we decided that we were going to move prosetin forward independently with our team at Columbia. And we realized, obviously, the importance of really having an expert in the room who knew the ins and outs of the FDA, who understood working with a small company, who was willing to think outside of the box, who has a background in neuroscience, and who could really help us put this package together, because we know the questions to ask, but we certainly don't know the answers. So Kevin Phelan, he is an expert consultant who is overseeing our regulatory strategy and our regulatory interactions for prosetin. He is a neuroscientist with 25 years of experience in new drug development, regulatory affairs, and compliance. And Dr. Phelan specializes in the design and execution of regulatory strategies related to new drugs, new formulations, and new therapeutic uses for drugs that are actually already approved. So Dr. Phelan actually received a PhD from University of Chicago, but then conducted postdoctoral research at Columbia University Medical Center. And when he came to meet with us for the first time, he reminded us that he just worked one floor above where our prosetin team did all of the ALS work to get to prosetin many years ago. I'm not quite sure how many years ago, a few years ago. Then after conducting his postdoctoral research at Columbia, he moved to Pfizer. He was at Pfizer for a 20-year career as a member of global R&D and worldwide regulatory affairs. He's worked extensively in an area of therapeutic areas, including neuroscience, pain, and inflammation, and has really just had a huge breadth of experience with the FDA from everything from very early drug development, where we are now with prosetin, just trying to open an investigational new drug application with the FDA to move into the clinic, all the way through drug approval and post-marketing interactions with the FDA. So as I said, when we first thought, maybe we can do this, as the Project ALS and Columbia team, we realized we needed to get some experts in the room to really help us figure out what a regulatory strategy would look like to get prosetin to people in a responsible and efficient way. We called Kevin, and we're going to hand it over to him now. So I think, Kevin, if you wouldn't mind, so you're a regulatory and drug development consultant, and I think it would be helpful just to sort of give an idea of what that actually means on a day-to-day basis, and sort of how you got to this point where you're supporting the Project ALS prosetin team effort here.
Okay, well, thank you, Erin, and thank you for the invitation, and most importantly, thanks for the opportunity to work on this project. It is becoming more interesting every day, and only in good ways, for the best of all reasons. So you covered a lot of ground in your introduction. And if I could just, round out a few of those points, just to add a little bit of color to, what is essentially a CV on LinkedIn. So it is indeed a small world. And, going from the bench in graduate school, working on the development of motor neurons, and then going and moving to Columbia, continuing to work on motor neurons, within what would now be called the Motor Neuron Center at Columbia's Medical Center. Moving to Pfizer, which at that time in 1991 was a much different company. And it was a company that was really trying to define talent and train it. And so, I and the people that were part of Pfizer in that generation benefited greatly from the company's growth, because we became true generalists from a drug development standpoint. And so, if you look at larger companies today and you talk to people that work there, they're much more segmented organizations. But back in the mid-90s at Pfizer, it was an incredibly energizing place to work. And people just did what they had to do. It had a very entrepreneurial feel that you would find in a smaller company today, I believe. But at the same time, had huge global resources. So, I really was fortunate to work on a number of projects, both from a clinical standpoint and a regulatory standpoint, that really set me up as a generalist for all the work that I'm doing as a consultant now, including what I'm doing with Project ALS. So, and you don't find many generalists anymore. You find people with niche experience. And so what I try to bring to an organization like yours is the ability to kind of see the big picture, not only from a clinical standpoint, but from a manufacturing, from a safety standpoint, and really put a program together. And the beauty of this program is that it's a blank slate. And so there you have the ability to basically design it from scratch. And hopefully that will pay off as we move into development when we encounter the aforementioned regulatory hurdles.
Thanks, Kevin. Yeah, I mean, I think you mentioned that you really have, in your experience at Pfizer, you really experienced a huge breadth of programs. And as you said, you're a generalist. So you've been with a lot of, you've worked with a lot of companies, I know, large, from big pharma like Pfizer to small startups. Is there anything that strikes you as unique about this particular effort, you know, trying to move prosetin into clinical trial for ALS?
Well, I mean, it's one of the most unique programs I've seen in the last 5 years because it is very small, which presents, you know, strengths and weaknesses. But the handful of people working on this are incredibly talented. And so, you know, everybody is kind of pulling in the same direction and moving towards the same goal. I mean, there is very much a focus on getting this IND put together. There's no doubt about it. And everybody's, you know, sort of doing their part to advance the effort. I mean, one of the most unique feature of this program, which still continues to amaze me, is that it is being mounted by a foundation. So, you know, when, you know, in my portfolio of clients, I have small to mid-sized companies. They typically have drug development backgrounds. They've usually worked at larger companies and moved into something a little bit more entrepreneurial, but they feel like, you know, like companies.
Right.
You know, what is really unique about this is this is a drug development effort in a team, but is supported by a foundation. And so when, you know, with indications like ALS, when you talk about foundations and patient advocacy, you see things like working with families, making sure FDA doesn't forget about the indication, and really being advocates for the patients, mostly from a visibility standpoint. But what Project ALS does is takes it to the next level, which is saying, we're going to develop a drug. So you do all of those things I just mentioned, but you also have, through the partnership with Columbia and the Motor Neuron Center, said, you know, we've got the scientific chops to really do this. And, you know, that's a big commitment, you know, to move from, you know, advocacy and what I would call traditional foundational work into becoming a research-based organization, which is what this feels like. And so I really give you a ton of credit for that.
Thanks, Kevin. I mean, I think the way that we think about it is, you know, what separates us from even a small biotech that's trying to move a program like this forward is that our investors, you know, the return on investment that we're hoping to provide is really not financial. It's in terms of moving the science forward in the field and also in hopefully offering a new treatment option to people with ALS. So I think that obviously we have a very different perspective, but yeah, we are trying to also fill the role of a typical small biotech that, you know, is interacting with the FDA and moving a drug to people. And I guess, Valerie, I think you're muted, but I think this sort of leads me to the next question. So we are trying to fill a very unique role. And as I mentioned at the top, I think that, you know, we know what we want to do. We have a good scientific team to get there, but there's a lot of detail that goes into actually getting a drug before the FDA and opening an IND. And I'm wondering if you could just sort of provide, I mean, obviously not the granular level, but sort of the view from 30,000 feet of what do you actually need to do when you have a promising drug in an academic laboratory, you feel really confident about the scientific data in ALS models that you've generated. but it's a new compound that's never been tried in a person before. What do you have to do then before the FDA is going to say, okay, you can give this to a person and move it into a phase 1 clinical trial?
Yeah, and I would just interrupt to say, I think the popular perception of drugs in development is that, you know, a perfectly promising drug is presented to the FDA, and the FDA just, you know, rules yay or nay, and, you know, then the drug is either passed through to people or it's completely rejected. You know, Erin and I were so excited that you would join us today because we felt you would give some color to the situation, that it's really more of a process, and in some ways more of a collaborative process with the FDA.
That's true. I would agree with that, Valerie. You know, this, you know, whenever you think about these sorts of programs, there are strategic discussions, and then there are very tactical operational things, because at the end of the day, when you set off on a journey like this, you know, it's really about doing things and you know, really executing on a plan. And so, and the plan becomes very complex from a scientific and from a safety standpoint. So in terms of a general overview of, you know, what is happening right now, there is the planning of an investigational new drug application is occurring. This is what is termed the pre-IND stage of a development program. And so we're building the scientific rationale. Columbia is doing that beautifully. We are starting to understand the early safety information that we're collecting to support the safety of the program. And that work is currently ongoing. There are experiments ongoing now. Even amongst the COVID-19 situation, we can get things done. And we're also thinking about the ultimate goal, which is, what is the clinical study going to look like when we actually, you know, move through the FDA process and get what's called a safe to proceed letter and get the IND open. So right now, we're doing fundamental science. We're understanding safety. We're doing a lot of document writing because at this stage, it's all about written preparation for FDA. You know, they will have seen other ALS programs. And so they kind of have an opinion, but there's a lot that's unique about this program that really needs to be carefully laid out and described in writing so that they can answer the questions that we ask them about, you know, what they would like to see from an efficacy and a safety standpoint in the first in human trial, or I should say the first in patient trial. So right now it's a lot of writing, it's a lot of planning. We have not, you know, short of getting a number for the IND, we've not approached FDA yet because we don't have all our ducks in a row, and it is a difficult situation right now to be interacting with FDA because there's so much else going around in the public health arena,
so to speak. But I was also wondering, though, Kevin, if you could give people a sense of the sort of other balls in the air for this program. So as you and the team at Columbia are writing these documents and communicating with FDA, can you talk a little bit about the manufacture of our test prosetin, and also some safety and toxicity testing that we're well into at Project ALS, but maybe you could just comment on how those elements are part of your process as well.
Yeah, so as you know, as you're putting a program like this together, you need lots and lots of different areas of expertise. You know, Columbia's area of expertise is the fundamental science around motor neuron survival and access to the central nervous system, which are must-haves for this drug to be successful. But in addition, there are lots of components that take specialized knowledge. So we have extremely talented chemists at Columbia. However, they don't have the big machines to make the medication at the kind of scale we need to move it into clinical development. And so there's this whole area of expertise of drug manufacturing under what's called good manufacturing practices, which basically has a purity standard to it that tells the FDA that this is well manufactured and it's suitable for introduction into the clinic. So manufacturing is always a big part of every program, and it will continue to be.
Valerie, you're muted again. You're muted again.
Sorry, guys. I've yet to master this technology, but we can speak in specifics, and I think it helps our audience and the community to know that our partner in GMP manufacturing is called Patheon. And maybe you could just tell us a bit about your interaction with Patheon, which Erin, please jump in because you're part of that.
Sure, I can speak. Yeah, I can speak in detail about that. So, so Project ALS made a wise choice in going with Patheon because they're a well-regarded manufacturing organization within the industry. They have the breadth of experience that they can offer, and thankfully they've been very collegial in sharing their experience with the project team, so that it's a very, very strong partnership between Patheon and the chemists at Columbia. And I would say similar for the non-clinical safety testing. There's a well-regarded organization called Charles River Laboratories that is grown to be quite a large organization that does a lot of the foundational safety testing for programs such as this. So we also have a partnership with Charles River to perform what are called the IND enabling studies that FDA will be looking for. And again, we've brought in a specialized toxicologist onto the team who's working very carefully with Charles River, and all of those studies are now beginning to take off and are in progress. So we're making good progress on the non-clinical front.
Yeah, and I would just say, I think, to this point about the team, both Patheon and Charles River are US based, and they're also sort of blue ribbon companies in a way. And while, obviously our resources are not unlimited as a nonprofit, we realize that having this really small team full of sort of the top experts in every way would be the best way forward. Since we are such a small team, we don't want this big issue where we're having to coordinate shipments from around the world and sort of wondering, what's going on at a certain point. We just know the people that we're working with, they're all in. We talk on a almost daily basis with almost every person that Kevin's mentioned on this team. And I think it's really helped to keep the program moving forward, even in this sort of unusual time, very unusual time with COVID-19.
I think that's a good point. I mean, I would also add that, we don't just phone it in with our partners. This is a true team, and I used the word family before. That may be overstating it, though. I feel like a member of an ever-growing family, but Patheon, Charles River, Kevin, Erin, and other consultants, and certainly the scientific team at Columbia are speaking many times a week, albeit from this new Zoom platform, which is odd, is it? Let's just say it's kind of odd. But, the COVID shutdown has not affected our intention to keep this program, which has many different facets, on track.
Yeah, and there's lots to do. I mean, in addition to what I just described in terms of bringing something to an FDA meeting, for an indication like ALS and a new treatment for ALS, there are a number of incentives that the federal government and the Food and Drug Administration have created to promote the development of drugs such as prosetin. And so and I've been encouraging Project ALS to avail themselves of these expedited programs to sort of heighten the visibility around what they're doing. And so, for example, there's the Orphan Drug Act. ALS is a horrible condition, but it's rare. And so the Orphan Drug Act was set up to encourage development of new drugs. And so we do plan on, doing some orphan drug work with FDA and applying. There's also something called fast track designation, which gives you more access and really more interaction with FDA to design the program in conjunction with them and hopefully move it forward quicker. That's the whole point of fast track designation. And so, as the laboratories are dark right now at Columbia, we're using that time to really get this stuff written up. And when the time is right, then we'll move ahead with FDA, and start having the more collaborative regulatory discussions with them.
Yeah, and Kevin, sort of to that point, I know some of this, so there are concrete things that we're doing now, and then there's sort of the more speculative idea of what a drug development program for a novel small molecule in ALS can look like. But I guess in general, do you think about something that's such a high unmet need indication like ALS? So while there are 2 FDA approved drugs for ALS and others in development, there's nothing that's readily available to people with ALS that really has a meaningful impact on the disease. So how do you approach a program like this differently than, a program like, well, I shouldn't compare, but, how do you approach a program like this differently?
Yeah, so I get your point in terms of, how you position yourselves for your regulatory discussions. For the 5th drug, for arthritis, or the 20th drug, I guess, we're probably up to 20 now for arthritis. It's a very different discussion than for something truly novel, for an indication where there really is no good therapy. I mean, you're correct to say that, there are 2 drugs approved, but I think clinicians would acknowledge that they're not terribly effective. And so, the scientific landscape is wide open. Unfortunately for ALS. And, this is a situation where science is going to drive the regulatory discussion. And in a situation like this, for any small, high unmet medical need, debilitating disease, I think FDA would let you ask them anything. And because you should, because there's no established pathway for this. And the science will guide this. There are many analogies you could use in the same way. Look at the spinal motor neuron atrophy programs. There have been 2 approved in the last year. These are motor neuron diseases. FDA took some flack for approving them on some pretty sparse data. But because there was so much unmet medical need, and the safety was acceptable, they saw a way to approve those drugs. And so I think if you can put the science forward, have a reasonable discussion with FDA about what makes sense based on what we know and where we are clinically, I think you can move quicker without a fairly rigid development pathway that you would see with a big indication, a large patient population that has lots known about it and has lots of other drugs to treat it.
Yeah. And I think this sort of goes back to what's unique about this program in that earlier discussion we were having, because again, while, our goal right now is to get prosetin into phase 1 clinical trial as quickly as possible. And we kind of have to keep our eyes on that prize right now because there's so much day-to-day work that gets us there. I think that, Kevin, you wouldn't disagree with this. There's not a need for a program where it's like a 6 months of a phase 1 program, and then 2 years for a phase 2 program, and then another 3 years for a 1,000-person phase 3 program for an ALS drug approval. I think there's quite a bit of wiggle room potentially, following the safety and the science, to condense that the clinical development period significantly.
Yeah, of course, and and FDA will acknowledge that. They have ways to accelerate programs, either through regulations or just through thinking it's a good scientific thing to do based on what we know, and this can be an accelerated pathway. And so as we move into these first discussions with FDA, yeah, we'll talk about what the first study looks like. But what I always like to do in situations like this is, have a little module at the end of a meeting that talks about future development, to try and look a little bit further down the road, so that we can at least get their preliminary thoughts on how can we get to point B, C, and D quick enough, and then ultimately what would a new drug application like this look like, which is a very premature question right now, but but you want to get to that question as quickly as possible.
Yeah.
There are opportunities in place to get there faster these days, and we're going to rely on you to guide us through that. We have a couple of good questions, Kevin, and Erin, you can certainly weigh in, and I'll feel free to do the same. A question from a gentleman, Jeff Deal, on Facebook. His question is, even though options for treating ALS have emerged in recent years, is it true that physicians still have very limited choices, or is it really a matter of limited resources? Good question. Thanks, Jeff. Does anybody want to jump in?
I can take a broad view, and then maybe Kevin can fill in some details. I like that dynamic that we have, Kevin. I think there are a lot of pieces to that question. I think that in terms of just what's FDA approved, doctors really do have limited choices. But then I think that there is infrastructure, that the FDA is actually encouraging through expanded access programs and off-label treatment that does fall down to a resource issue, because there are certainly drugs in clinical trial for ALS or approved for other drugs that have some scientific preclinical or clinical science backing them up in ALS that most patients don't have access to, because the ability for either a company to provide an expanded access program isn't there, or their doctors don't have the infrastructure to really submit these single-use INDs to the FDA to give them off-label access to drugs. And Kevin, I know you have a lot of experience with these types of programs, so maybe you can fill in on a more granular level.
So a couple of points on that question. So we have 2 approved drugs. They're not very good. This prosetin is not the only program that's working towards an approval for ALS. There are other companies mounting ALS development programs. And I think that's a good thing. I think you want to have competition in this, in terms of lots of companies pursuing lots of mechanisms for this patient population. So there are a lot of resources being put behind this when you look at the various companies doing the work. In terms of access, this is always a very tricky area, because companies and programs view this slightly differently. If you're doing a development program for ALS, you've got your set of protocols running, and there's oftentimes some reluctance to basically provide lots of small INDs for at an early stage in development. But at the same time, with a lot of this, this new legislation about right to try and patient access, it can get it can get very tense sometimes.
Yeah, actually, I just wanted to
Patients
jump
do.
in with a related
Yeah.
question from Tom Childs, I think also through Facebook. Kevin, this would be to you. The FDA seems beholden to big pharma, and the regulations are causing people to die, possibly unnecessarily. Whatever happened to right to try?
Okay, so all right, so that's a very well timed question. There, the patients do have a right to try it, but there is also the rights on the part of the company, and so and this is really where it can sometimes get difficult, and I've seen this just in the past couple of weeks with COVID-19, coincidentally, where particularly in New York City, there were patients and their physicians were advocating on their behalf to gain access to investigational medicines, not being studied for COVID-19, but for related disorders. And so I will say that from a humanitarian standpoint, the companies were very open to this, as was FDA. But it's a very unique situation. So when you bring that back to something like a new treatment for ALS, I think you have to take the same mindset. If there is a patient who, for whatever reason, can't be enrolled in a clinical trial, and seems to fit the profile so that the drug could be administered to be safe, it's a very simple process to make that drug available, and FDA would not resist that. So it's really incumbent on the company to make that decision, because ultimately they're the ones who are providing the medication.
Yeah. So Kevin, I think this is obviously a hot topic that we discuss at Project ALS and in the broader ALS community. But from your vantage point, are there certain things that you see that sort of incentivize companies to sort of come to the table in that way and be more willing to provide drug, or do you think it's really sort of a case by case thing? Like, is there anything that strikes you about what makes companies more willing to provide expanded access?
Well, I mean, there are lots of different incentives. Some of them are financial, some of them are legislative, some of them are just good perception of the company, something very intangible. So so I think what FDA has done is they've created these formal incentive programs for companies. When it comes to an individual patient right to try aspect, that's company leadership decisions, and I can't speak for those companies because they're all different.
Yeah. All right, we have some other really good questions. So here's one submitted through Zoom. This isn't necessarily prosetin related, but just for your expertise, Kevin. A few decades ago, during the initial AIDS battle, there was a national IRB. It appears nowadays IRBs are at multiple sites. Seems very redundant. Would it be beneficial to trials if advocates work on establishing national IRBs again? And are there pros versus cons to that kind of approach?
Okay, quite an astute question. So there are, in fact, national IRBs. I don't know that they exist for all patient populations in all cases, but I can tell you from firsthand experience that I have reviewed grant applications for NIH where that have been sort of big multi-center type grants, and one thing that's been mandated is that everything goes through one IRB, and this is for large, complicated infectious disease programs. So they do exist. Again, when or how they get set up is very variable. If you've got, one sponsorship of one protocol with, 20 different centers, and the protocol's the same, it makes total sense to have a central IRB for this.
Yeah,
If it's a
let's
relatively
talk more
small,
about them.
what's that,
I
Valerie?
like this idea.
Yeah, you can, there, I mean, you can easily set these up.
Yeah, so I think, sort of a corollary question that we've received is, will you consider joining the platform trial? And I actually think we're hoping to get Jinsey Andrews on to speak about this and other clinical trial design considerations more closely. She's been drafted into some, strange clinical work here in New York City these past few weeks, but we do hope to bring her on as a future guest. I think the short answer is certainly yes, and I think the platform trial is a really good example of a central IRB being implemented with hopefully great success in the ALS field. So
yeah, we're all for it. So I just wanted to, we're going to have to wrap this up shortly. There's one more question, which goes back to the basics and some of the reasons we're so excited about prosetin. Gwen Peterson asks, what's unique about the science? And I think I touched on the beginning on the couple of the three main excitement points for prosetin is that it readily crosses the brain-blood barrier, which can't be said for many medications, frankly. It's orally available, so it's pretty easily taken. And thirdly, it has a therapeutic target in a cellular stress called ER stress. And experiments indicate that prosetin hits that stress pathway, which is a big deal. So for those three reasons, we're really excited. I didn't know if Kevin or Erin, you wanted to add any other reasons for the science, the excitement over the science in this case.
well, I think I would also add, and we have another question asking us to talk more about the drug. So I think we can post a link on this when we send out a post-webinar email and on Facebook to the initial kickoff scientific webinar that we hosted with Emily Lowry and Jinsey Andrews at Columbia, where they really dig deep into what sets prosetin apart in terms of science and sort of what the process was to get here. And we'll be talking about this more in the coming weeks also.
Yeah,
I guess there are a couple of other questions here just about limiting a trial to the US or patient access outside of the US. And I think that maybe Kevin could speak to the specific regulatory pathways there. I think, the answer for us is, we're a small team and we want to start where we live, where we have a handhold and where we really have, a relationship with the FDA and get things moving here. But certainly our goal isn't to keep prosetin limited to the US. And maybe Kevin can fill in a little bit more detail on sort of the global development here.
So it's true to say that we're focused on FDA initially, but this is a rare disease, and so just from a practical enrollment standpoint, and FDA will tell you this, you should go international to really get access to the broadest number of patients. And in terms of the earlier point of how do we move quicker, going international can be quicker just because you have a larger pool of patients to potentially enroll in clinical trials. Now, that comes at a price because now I have to deal with all these other regulatory agencies. But if we've established a pathway with FDA, it doesn't mean everybody else is just going to say okay, but it certainly gives us a chance to go in and and have discussions with some prior knowledge, or we can simply just open up what are called clinical trial authorizations in Western European countries, and just get local authority approval. So we can, you can certainly, expand the program. At a certain point, it becomes time and resources.
Yeah. I know we have to wrap up. I just see two really important questions that I want to make sure we get to. So one, FDA told us last fall when they issued the ALS guidance that they like it when developers bring patients to FDA meetings. We recently saw a new phase 3 trial design that was anything but patient-centric. I can't imagine that actual people with ALS were part of the design or FDA discussions. This is all in quotes, by the way. This is not me editorializing. So the question is, will you include people with ALS in the trial design? Will you listen to them, and will you include them in your FDA meetings? And Valerie, maybe you want to start with this, and then Kevin also.
I mean, people with ALS are the raison d'etre. It's the reason prosetin exists in the first place. Project ALS started over 20 years ago when my sister Jennifer was diagnosed with ALS at the age of 35. And when we looked around to see who was making a concerted effort to understand or treat the disease, we weren't really finding much of a team effort. I mean, there are amazing organizations who are supporting patient services across the country and the world, which is fantastic. But my sisters and I and our family and friends, which became Project ALS, decided that there needed to be a laser focus on ALS research. So really, people with ALS are at the heart of everything we do at Project ALS. This drug has been designed for ALS, with ALS in mind, by experts, mostly at Columbia University in this case, in the case of prosetin, to understand how we might treat a drug, develop a drug that would target cellular pathways that are relevant to the ALS disease process. And in going forward, it's ALS patients and people who love them who are funding the effort to get prosetin to clinical trial, which actually, and I think we have to bring this to a close, guys, but I just want to let you know that, Kevin Phelan is part of the Project ALS prosetin team, and you guys all know Erin, and you know me. This is not a conversation that concludes here. Please feel free to write in, to call us, and tell us what you think. There have been some great questions today, by the way. But just getting back to the role of ALS patient. Yes, we plan to involve people with ALS in advocacy for prosetin going forward. The drug has been designed for people with ALS, but guess what? We're also facing a really tough reality. I mean, the whole world is, and that is the COVID-19 reality, which has sadly dried up the revenue stream at Project ALS. So for example, in the next couple months, we had planned to raise nearly $1 million more for prosetin and the campaign to get prosetin to human trial in 2020. But those opportunities have gone away with the COVID shutdown. So what we're doing today is we're going to ask you to try to help us rescue the program and keep us on our timeline, which has already been affected by right around 3 months, sad to say, but let's not let it get out of hand. Let's not make it 6 months or 4 months even. And the way you can help today is by going to prosetin2020.org. That's prosetin, Prosetin 2020. Oh, is it org?
Yes.
I'm sorry, did I say com?
No, you're good.
I did? Wow. Yay. And just give what you can today. I know everybody's really tight now, but if you can give $5 today or $10 today, prosetin2020.org. If you're a fat cat, 50, 100 more. I don't know where you guys are coming from, but we really need you now at Project ALS. And the sole purpose of this fundraising is to get prosetin to human trial in this calendar year. Now, if you go to that same website, prosetin2020.org, you guys are going to find a really cool new tool that will give you some ideas for how you can do online fundraising that's maybe even as effective or more than this live stream. There's some really cool ideas, and they're really easy to execute if you go to the prosetin website. Really, I think you can have a lot of fun raising funds for prosetin online. And then finally, we also wanted to let you know today that Project ALS is planning some really cool, like celebrity-studded fundraisers to share with you online. We'll be announcing some of them soon. And again, the sole purpose is to raise money for the prosetin program. It's prosetin2020.org. I really want to thank Dr. Kevin Phelan. You Your leadership has been invaluable, continues to be. You've steadied the ship many times. It's been incredible to me to watch you and Erin and the team keep prosetin on path. But again, to our audience, we really need you now. So give as you can. We want to hear from you. Write as you can. And let's work.
Yeah. And we'll see you very soon. You know, we'll be back here with more helpful information, hopefully. Maybe we'll get Kevin to come back at some point, but in the meantime, you know, stay safe, everyone, and we'll talk to you very soon.
Stay safe. And Kevin, thanks again.
Thank you, Valerie. Thank you, Erin. And I hope everybody stays well.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.